The VS Code team has just taken unprecedented action. They deleted a theme from the VS Code store, and they uninstalled it from millions of users' devices. This isn't just any theme, by the way. It's the material theme. It's not a good theme. I would never use this. One that's kind of surrounded in drama we've talked about in the past, and I'm sure we're going to have to continue. What's the reason they took it down for? For Microsoft to go this far with an extension, it must be a really bad thing that Mattia did, right? Well, kind of. This is a very, very weird situation full of delicate nonsense, to put it frankly. You don't do this if you don't have something that you're trying to hide. There's a lot to dive into here, from obfuscation to bad faith shipping to just terrible practices from an ex-open source developer. I have spent far too much time, we're talking like 40 plus hours over the last 4 days, trying to figure out everything going on here. I actually already recorded a different video about this. You might notice my shirt and outfit changing throughout. Insanity. That's because we're going to use some of the parts there that are still correct. I just want to go out of my way to make sure I got the best possible source for this whole thing, because there is chaos floating all over when you try to look into the situation. So, after maintaining this fork for far too long, putting all of this time into researching and bringing on multiple other people, including security experts, to try and figure out what's going on, we have some bills to pay. So before I can dive in, quick word from today's sponsor, then we'll get straight to it. No sponsor today, so check out T3 Chat if you haven't yet. I'll sweeten the deal a bit. It's only $8 a month, but for the first 100 people to sign up, here's a code to get it for free. Anyways, back to whatever I was just ranting about. I think it's important to start from where I started, which was an HN thread of all things. I was sent this thread from an existing employee of the VS Code team. You can see him here, Eastor. He put a lot of work in here, as did the whole VS Code team. I'm honestly really impressed with how hard they've worked in order to get all of this under control. I want to make sure we call that out because it's important work. I got notified of this because I have a fork of the theme due to the aforementioned drama. If you haven't already checked out the video that this theme's trying to sue, real quick TLDR is that Mattia decided to make his theme not open source anymore, got really mad at other people for using the old open source version and for bringing in those colors into other projects under similar names. He started threatening to sue them, including other open source editors like Zed. Absolute nonsense. He's apparently been doing this stuff for years. He even did it to Sublime Text way back when. So not unusual behavior for him to just be a malicious, obsessive, frankly, dumbass. But here we are. So the VS Code team was notified that there were malicious things going on inside of the package material theme, which was a very popular package still, despite the fact that I and many others had covered how egregious it was being maintained. This package is particularly interesting because the entire history of it has been deleted, and because Mattia's an obsessive asshole, he has went out of his way to obfuscate everything going on in the package. He's also not a very good developer, which means that this package has a lot of things it probably shouldn't for a theme. I would know. I've been maintaining a fork of it for quite a bit of time now, and it has not been a fun code base to work in, because instead of just keeping track of hex codes in JSON, like, every single other theme ever does, he built his own crazy pile of generators that have access to things like spawning processes and reading from your file system in a theme, remind you. I've been going out of my way to gut as much of this stuff as possible from the fork. We've made a lot of progress so far. I've already deleted like 10,000 plus lines of code, and no users have even noticed a difference because, again, it's just a theme. It should just be JSON files keeping track of colors, but it's not. And by all indications, this seemed like it was very, very clearly malicious. Malicious extensions in particular are nasty because extensions extend other things you're doing, which means they have access to a lot of things that you might not expect them to. Browser extensions, VS Code extensions, and all sorts of other mods and extensions on other platforms tend to be a huge potential surface area for exploits and risk because they are much easier to install and add. They are much simpler. We don't think as much about them, but they have the same levels of access that a lot of other things do. Google's been going really hard locking down the extension marketplace for Chrome for this reason. Seems like Microsoft's trying to do similar to VS Code because, again, the risk profile here is insane. We need to know what a malicious package is. Obviously, the simple definition is a package that does things a user would not want without that user knowing. Obviously, this implies dangerous things like stealing your data, changing things they shouldn't, ransomware, all sorts of things. What's more important is, what does a malicious package look like? When you look at the source code for something malicious, if it's not obfuscated, it's usually pretty clear. It's accessing things it shouldn't and doing things it shouldn't. The most clear sign something is malicious is that it's requesting stuff that it has no real reason to need access to. Generally speaking, if there's a piece of software that's requesting access to things it shouldn't need, there's a very, very high chance it's malicious. There's a second part to this I think is worth calling out. Has dependencies for things it shouldn't need. A great example here would be a theme needing access to file system and spawning child processes. There's no reason a theme should be able to spin up some process on your computer or read files from your root file system. Those aren't things a theme should do. Therefore, if a theme is doing that, it's very likely that that theme is doing something malicious. There is one more key that makes it much more likely software is malicious, though, which is efforts to obfuscate what the code is doing. And this is a really, really big one. It's incredibly rare that malicious software is published without doing some level of obfuscation. If we go back to the previous big hack of last year called the XEUtils hack, which was done by obfuscating some weird binary code inside of the open source package, such that it was basically impossible to know what it was doing, and it subtly, quietly snuck out and infected millions of computers with the possibility of stealing and sending off data in places it absolutely shouldn't have. And that was all possible because the code was obfuscated. So you couldn't just read line by line what it was doing. Even though you had the source code, it just was jumbled into gibberish, so no human could reasonably understand what it was doing. Usually you do this by compiling a binary, but since there are languages like, JavaScript, where you're just sending the actual scripts down, you can't obfuscate just through compilation. You have to do other things and put actual effort in. If you go look at any of the VS Code extensions you have installed, even the ones that are doing things, they probably aren't obfuscating in these ways because they don't need to. They're just trying to send the JS to the user. It's also worth noting that these types of obfuscation tend to hurt performance as much as like 80%. So you'll end up with code that's 80% slower by doing this, which means chances are if you're heavily obfuscating the code that you wrote, you're doing it in a malicious way. Needless to say, if your source code for your extension looks like this, you're hiding something. That's not up for debate. You don't do this if you don't have something that you're trying to hide. Even formatted, it's nonsense, and you'll see why. There's all of these crazy parse int calls grabbing random references that are used to recreate things as basic as strings that you're trying to use in your app. This level of obfuscation was done very specifically because the creator, Mattia, does not want people to see what he is doing in this code. Generally speaking, if something has all of these traits, the reason is because it is malicious. If something is requesting access stuff it doesn't need, if it's using dependencies, especially ones that have massive security implications that it doesn't need, and it's heavily obfuscating the code that is actually being shipped, it is almost impossible to assume that that thing isn't intentionally doing it maliciously. Anyone who does all of these things to a given piece of software, especially one that previously did none of them, is almost certainly doing it with the goal of being malicious, infecting users, or generally causing harm. Almost always is the key here, though, because there's a common phrase, do not attribute to malice what could be attributed to stupidity. And I know for a fact that Mattia is incredibly stupid. The amount of things I've seen, the people I've talked to from his past, he seems somewhat capable of building design systems, but he seems entirely incapable of taking criticism, of not being recognized for the work he considers to be impeccable, and over-engineering the shit out of things that have no need for it at all. Because of that, it's hard for me to say that this is clearly a malicious act. Everything he has done before and after was, and despite the fact that he has been going after me now for 6 months, he has been consistently slandering and degrading me publicly about things he's made up in his weird conspiratorial castle of bullshit. And the fact that he is actively harming the open source community and people I care about and destroying the reputation of this whole industry by being such an asshole, I want to take the time to try and defend him. Because I do genuinely think he is just the stupidest dev to ever have a package with this many installs. So let's go through my theoretical, what I think might have actually happened here. First and foremost, the previous drama all happened because Mattia was upset that he couldn't make more money off of his OSS package. It is worth noting that the material theme was not just his work. There were a lot of other people involved. Hundreds of people had committed by the time he decided to take it offline, which is the next step. He changed the license of the material theme because he wanted to start selling it. He had already made like $10,000-ish off the Open Collective for material theme, all of which he paid himself in absolute bullshit ways, but he wanted more. He felt like he was not getting what he deserved, so he took down the Apache 2 license and he rewrote the entire commit history of the project. Rewriting is an obsessive thing that he likes to do. But he did all of that because he wanted to be able to sell the theme and make more money, specifically hoping no one would be able to maintain a fork because he had hidden all of the code. He started to get blowback from this. There's one additional step here. It's what I mentioned from the previous video, where he was obsessively targeting the creators of other software that included Material Theme, in particular other editors like Zed and Sublime Text. He was constantly flaming them publicly. My whole introduction to Mattia's insanity was me reading a blog post on Dev2, just a random blog site that I was curious about. At the bottom, there was a recommended new post. The Zed editor is bad for open source and destroying the industry. And I read it, and it was the most insane thing I'd read in a long time. I then went and looked at his GitHub issues and realized he was just actively harassing these open source maintainers. So I jumped in with hey, what the hell's going on here? Nothing here is fair to say. Your code was open source. Seems like you're mad that people remember that it used to be open source. Because this exploded, I took it on myself to fork the last version that I could find before he changed the license, and I still maintain that fork. When you have a code base that has been maintained by lots of people under a specific license, you can't just change the license of it and expect the old versions to have their license revoked as well, especially when others have helped create that code and none of them agreed to this change. So all of these forks are totally legit. He did not believe this at the time and was quite upset about it. Now he's flipped in his own deranged way to say, see, there are all these forks. Clearly I did nothing wrong. Otherwise they wouldn't be able to make forks. That's not what you were saying 6 months ago, bud. But sadly, it kept spiraling. He went hard to make sure nobody could use any of the things he considered to be his innovations anymore, unless they were paying him. This included things like the chaotic pile of code he wrote to generate the themes. He wanted to make sure any changes he made to that were not accessible publicly because he was so upset the fork was getting attention and his code was not. Because of that, he started to do things you really shouldn't do. He started to first and foremost, spiral into crazy packages and other imports that were not necessary for things, in particular, the icon pack that he was using. And he started to obfuscate the shit out of the code that he was bundling because he didn't want anyone to know what he was doing and why he was doing it, because if they did, they could copy it as far as he is concerned. Remember, I'm doing my best to be good faith here. The only way you can assume we got here is if you also assume that Mattia is a narcissistic, entitled asshole that doesn't know a thing about software. If you presume all of that to be true, then maybe there is a possibility he wasn't actually trying to ship malicious code here. With all of that said, the next step was that after all the things he did, being a one-to-one match to what somebody doing malicious behavior would be, his extension got removed. Microsoft took a bit longer to publish than I would have liked. It was still really quick considering the severity of the problem. This is the first update ever to the new removed packages section on the VS Marketplace repo. The Equinus Osea, which is his other handle, Mattia, it goes by this everywhere, was removed on the 26th of February. And the reason they describe is that it was a theming extension with heavily obfuscated code and unreasonable dependencies, including a utility for running child processes. This is honestly a fair reason to remove an extension, especially when it's this popular with a maintainer that is this, I don't know what word to use other than like risky. He's kind of explosive. You never know what he's going to do next. And he has shown so little care for doing things right for his users, for the maintainers of these open source tools, and for the ecosystem as a whole, that he is a ticking time bomb. It's just a matter of has he already exploded or not. So again, this extension got removed for reasonable reasons. If we were to presume that this wasn't malicious, which we're still not fully sure of, supposedly there are actual malicious things in this bundle, despite the fact that I and many others have been trying to find them, and we're just finding really bad practice. We've yet to find something explicitly, obviously malicious. The risk profile is still really high. It makes perfect sense that the extension was removed. Now we're going to dive into theoretical land. What if he had behaved a bit differently? Nothing I'm about to say is what actually happened. I'll let you know when that changes. If Mattia's response to this was in any way understanding, if he was to reach out to the VS Code team and say, hey, I think you guys got something wrong. I'm not sure why I was flagged here. I would love to chat and make any changes you would request in order to get this fixed. Then there would be an actual redemption potential here. This is presuming that he was very calm and collected in his request for this, and that the VS Code team was to respond, let him know what was wrong, and they would have to change all of the things I mentioned before. He'd have to stop requesting things he shouldn't need. He'd have to stop using dependencies that he shouldn't need. He'd also have to stop obfuscating the shit out of the code. Because if you're doing all three of these things, it is very, very likely, almost more likely than not, I'd say 90% of the time plus, if you're doing all of these things, you're shipping malware. He could acknowledge that he was doing those things. He could acknowledge it was a mistake and that he was stupid for it, and then apologize, fix it, publish the source code again, and take the opportunity to fix the problem. Now we go back into what actually happened. What he did next was genuinely insane. He didn't reach out. He started complaining everywhere he possibly could, conspirizing and throwing everyone under the bus that was even vaguely associated with him, the extension, and the VS Code team. This one was particularly funny. This post has since been deleted because he has since republished, removed, and hidden this repo, I think 8 or 9 times. He has made over 500 GitHub accounts in the last 2 days, and he has tried to circumvent the attempt to take down his extension by republishing it under 4 different names. If we're looking at this in terms of the things someone would do if they were actually trying to be malicious, he has checked every single box. The only box on the hacker list that he hasn't checked is the smart enough to do a hack box. Unfortunately, all of our extensions have been censored and pulled down without any possibility of appeal, notice, or apparent reason. Really sad day. The main reason is due to a stupid and ignorant person who shared a fake and defamatory video on YouTube, spreading false and invented information without knowing the real facts. Most of that video was spent with me reading his blog posts and his comments. So I agree that those videos were actually full of fake and defamatory information and things that weren't actual facts. It's just that those were there because he wrote them. All of the misinformation that exists in my videos about Mattia is information he created in order to spin some crazy conspiratorial narrative. This is a very, very dangerous person that we need to go out of our way to keep out of open source and make sure anyone else exhibiting similar behavior is also kept out. His conspiracies continue to spiral out of control, going as far as saying that I was conspiring with the VS Code team and my friends over there in order to get them banned as aggressively and quickly as possible. I was reached out to after all of this happened, remind you, by someone who I'd never even heard of before. It turns out I actually do have one friend that's on the VS Code team. I didn't know about any of that before all of this, so thank you, Mattia, for letting me know that one of my friends is on the team. But she was not the one involved in any of the stuff that we were talking about right now. It was a different person who I'd never heard of before who hit me up after the thing had already went viral on Hacker News because you are a malicious asshole. None of this has anything to do with me beyond the fact that my fork is popular enough that I got brought up a whole bunch here, and Isidore wanted to make sure that my fork didn't have whatever malicious bullshit was going on in the official extension. I put my comment up here after spending the entire night. I was up until 5 a.m. this night, auditing the shit out of this code, pulling in all the people I had to make sure the version I had published was safe. And it is. There are things in there I want to remove because they depend on things that he still technically has publication rights to. None of that is code that is bundled in the extension, but it is used to bundle the extension, so I will be ripping every single fucking line of it out. Because I wanted to take this abundance of precaution, I spent a lot of time on this, and I found quite a few things. First and foremost, when I was doing this, I told the VS Code team directly that if they do find malware while I am working on this, or while I'm asleep, or while I'm streaming the next day, they don't have to wait for me to tell them it's okay, take it down. They had actually told me before that they would let me know before any action was taken. I rejected that offer because I care more about my users having secure devices and not being affected by potential malware than I would ever care about having an extension with 1,000 installs. I don't give a shit. So I told them explicitly, I don't care. Somebody else was saying, how dare you think that you have that much control over the VS Code team? I was rejecting an offer they gave me. My haters are insane. Anyways, part 2 is that I audited the entirety of this code base, which took a while. There was a lot of nonsense in there. I also removed all of the code related to changelogs, analytics, and Open Collective, as well as HTML rendering, because he had built a very elaborate system for rendering changelogs that had 2 sentences each. Instead of just putting them inside of the repo like everyone else does ever, he maintained a separate Sanity blog. Sanity is a CMS for managing blog posts, where he would put the 2 sentences there and then use the sketchy client to pull the data down and render it in this HTML, all for this fancy release notes view that was garbage. So I just removed it. If you want to audit the code, it's all open source and there and available for anyone to do whatever the hell they want to. Yeah, people were being total assholes to me. Just one. You know what? I'll be fair. Most people have been really, really chill about this one because I think it's clear I'm operating in good faith. I don't like this theme. I'll never use this theme, but I'm still maintaining a fork of it because I care more about people having safe open source software than I could ever pretend to care about using the right theme. I will probably never use this theme. I have to probably rename it now, though, because it's VSC material theme, but I won't sue you. Now it's but I won't sue or hack you or install dependencies that look like I'm trying to hack you. Kind of insane. We spent a lot of time trying to figure out what was up with this package, and most of that effort was going towards the material theme. It turns out the one that was the most malicious, or most potentially malicious, wasn't the material theme. It was the material icon theme that he was also managing and publishing. This one had all sorts of nasty utilities and things in it that were not things that should ever reasonably be in a theme of any form. It should be a bunch of SVGs. Not in Mattia land. In Mattia land, you do a lot of things that anyone else would never reasonably do. But when you think you're the only righteous person and everyone else is evil and out there to get you, you stop thinking reasonably. As we can see with his most recent attack, now he opened a new issue on the VS Marketplace because they locked the other one so we couldn't reply in it anymore. This one is absolute insanity and kind of shows how mentally ill he might be at this point. If you click the edits button here, you'll see my favorite Mattia-ism. Before I click it, I want you to guess how many times he has edited this post. 24 times in 10 hours. Not even. Dude is insane. Actually insane. In multiple of these, he has my favorite little trope of his. He kept changing his mind if he wanted to include this or not. There it is. He kept adding and removing a clown emoji next to my name. That's the type of person he is. Oh, look, he left that in the end. All forks created when our extension was open source combined the exact same so-called compromised code, just without the obfuscation. Yet, instead of taking them down, you reached out to them after our ban, as stated by Theo. Yes, because my code was open source, so they didn't have to have a security team reverse engineer it to figure out what the hell it was doing. Unlike yours, Mattia. Are you saying that the entire time this code has been closed source and you have been claiming that you need all of this support and all of this money, you haven't actually changed anything about the extension? Because that's not true. Also worth noting that, as the VS Code team said, it was the icon package, not the theme, that was the problem. And as always, you are trying to steer towards whatever tiny, tiny microscopic little point might almost make you look okay in this one instance. But I want to emphasize how severely you have fucked up here, Mattia. At every single step throughout this, before, during, and after, Mattia has done the wrong thing. This all started with the drama around the original material theme. The first thing that he did the most wrong possible way was his attempt to go after the Sublime Text people for including a material theme. I could go a step further and say that even using the name material was a mistake, because the name material is part of a design system that Google made, not Mattia. It's called that because he is trying to grab onto something else's success in order to get some amount of attention. The next thing that he screwed up was trying to change the licensing of the project without permission from anyone else. License changes have happened in the past. They're always big, dramatic things, but they usually happen from this point forward, and the team that is making the change will always call out that you can continue using the old version, maintaining it, using it for whatever you want under the old license. It's just from this point forward, we're under a different license. Mattia did not do that because Mattia cannot ever help himself but do the most wrong possible thing. So what Mattia did instead was he deleted the entire source history and all contributions without deleting their code. So there is no longer any history of the hundreds of people who have contributed to these things in the past because he nuked all of it. He loves that good old force push with a single commit. Here's a screenshot of his GitHub activity before this drama really ramped up. I can't show you his profile because he made it private because he loves to hide things. All of these projects have more than 10 commits other than these last two here. And if you go and look at them, they all have one commit because he didn't actually make 15 commits. He rewrote the first commit 15 times because he is so obsessed with deleting, hiding, and obfuscating every single fucking thing he can because he's a lunatic. So after he deleted the entire source history and contributions without deleting the code, he then did what started this really big malicious spiral. Even the Sublime Text thing, if that was a one-off thing, it could be forgiven. If any of these were a one-off thing, they might be somewhat forgivable and redeemable. But the theme of Mattia consistently doing the worst possible thing every single time he perceives himself as being wronged is why we have the assumption he's being malicious here. Because the next thing he did was attack Zed full force. This one has like 15 layers where he did the worst possible thing, but the fact that he harassed the developers on GitHub, didn't get the response he wanted, and then he decided to go public, writing an article claiming that they were destroying open source by lying about them incessantly and hiding the fact that this whole project was open source, obfuscating his history, obfuscating the details, the Mattia theme, you know. The only thing that Mattia is consistent about with his theming is his inability to do anything right. Yeah. And for once, I decided to play his game a tiny bit. I made a blog post. I don't post on my blog a whole lot, but I did it because I want to make sure that when you Google search his name, you find the history of the terrible things he has done, because I don't want anyone else to make the mistake of accidentally hiring a lunatic like this and ending up with utter chaos internally as a result. I've only done this once in the past, and it was with the guy who made Faker.js, because he was an absolute lunatic who actually did ship malware, by the way. The spiral is very common. Someone feels like they should make more money than they do on their open source project they haven't maintained for 10 years. They get really mad at anybody else doing similar things. They delete the repo or obfuscate the code. They beg for open source contributions and don't get as many as they expect. Not contributions of code, contributions of money. They beg endlessly for money from Open Collective and things like that. They get flamed when people realize how insane and malicious they are being. They blame everything around them, be it Microsoft, be it YouTubers, be it influencers, be it the open source community. And then when all else fails, they ship malware. This is what happened with the Faker.js Maroc dude. This is what's happening here too. We still don't have the full details. I am straight up 50-50 on if the package was actually malware, and the only way the package isn't malware is if he is actually just that stupid. Anyways, don't hire this dude. Hopefully this gets enough SEO that no one will accidentally make that mistake and hire him. But we're still just going through the things he has done wrong here. He attacked Zed full force. He harassed them on GitHub. He harassed them through the blog post. And when he was called out for that blog post, he replied to me incredibly rudely, realized who I was, and then deleted the post. I then emailed him for his comment on this because I planned on covering it. That, I think, is honestly the point where he realized how big of a deal this might be. So he responded to requests for comment by writing a life essay and then blocking on all platforms. If he was actually innocent, if he wasn't doing everything as wrong as possible, he could have taken that opportunity to handle it proper, but he didn't. He went into attack mode. All he knows how to do is attack and conspire. After my video came out, though, for the most part, he seemed to shut up and just go off into his own world. That said, he still felt incredibly wronged, at which point he did what I would consider the worst possible thing, obfuscate everything that you do going forward, while also doing riskier stuff every day. Because he felt so entitled, he decided no one else should ever have the right to see his code again, so he's going to obfuscate all of it. That's not the right solution. Of the things on this list, this is probably the least wrong thing he did, but it's still wrong enough that for most people, it'd be a pretty good, you can't trust that guy anymore. After that, the extension got removed, which he could have responded to well, but instead, full attack mode post removal. He just went in. He has been constantly dragging and defaming me and many others in his attempts to show that he's the only one who is right. Everyone else in the situation is as wrong as possible. And then in parallel to all of this, he went out of his way to keep shipping the extensions by any means possible. This included spinning up new GitHub orgs, spinning up over 500 new GitHub accounts, publishing it under different names, publishing it under the same name in different orgs, moving this repo 8+ times, and also posting a zip of it, which was different from the version that was published on the store, by the way, because he is trying to hide what he was doing with the obfuscation. And at any point throughout any of these things, I would have been more than willing to forgive Mattia if he had just apologized and stopped during this spiral. But as he has continued to be wrong, he has continued to deny and get worse and worse, doing worse and worse things, never once taking the time to admit that he was wrong or apologize to the harm he has caused to hundreds of developers in the open source ecosystem and to the millions of users of a theme that he didn't even create. All of that said, if he was down to own all of this, if Mattia actually takes the time to reflect and acknowledges that this isn't the actions of a good faith maintainer of a package or theme, these are the actions of somebody with malicious intent. If he's able to recognize why the rest of the world sees it that way, that we look at this list of things he has done back to back to back to back, every single time, not doing the right thing, not apologizing, not taking ownership, at every single step, doing the worst possible behavior. If he could acknowledge that is what happened here, I would be down to unlist both of my videos and apologize publicly, take down my blog, and do whatever I can to help him with his redemption arc. But in order for him to start a redemption arc, he has to start apologizing and owning and understanding the amount of bad things he did. Literally every single opportunity there was a decision for him to make, he looked at the right decision, he looked at the wrong decision, and he said, how can I do something worse than the wrong decision? Every single time. I'm trying to go with the right analogy for this, but being that he has established this theme of doing the worst possible thing at every step, We have to draw a line of the before and after the extension was taken down here. The line is right here. Everything above this line were things he did wrong before. I would gladly make the argument that doing all of these things removes our ability to give you any amount of good faith as an open source developer and maintainer if you harm the open source community in these ways with the goal of destroying the careers of others who are actually acting in good faith, by the way. We can no longer assume you are operating in good faith. Let's say somebody was a really strong Greenpeace advocate. They wanted to have gas cars stop being used because they care so much about green technologies. That's a mission I think we can all get behind and understand. Like, it is important that we use less gas and use less oil. But if they did that by threatening and harassing every single person who dared drive a gas car for years, we would probably be suspicious of their motives. Now imagine after years of establishing your willingness to harm others for their use of what you perceive as an evil thing, gas, suddenly you get a job working at a car mechanic and you show up on the first day with a gun, with knives, and with scissors so you could destroy the cars and maybe even the people doing these things. We're going to assume what your intent is there because you have established a long history of bad intent and horrible actions towards people that you look towards this way. If it turns out those things were just left in the car because your friend who does those things had left them there, you didn't know about it and forgot about it, and just also happened to bring them into the workplace with you magically, it is theoretically possible that you didn't actually have that intent. But it is more impossible for people who have paid any attention up until that point to look at this thing that even if you had done none of this in the past, if you had just shown up to work like that for the first day, having none of the history, we would still assume you were doing something malicious. When you combine the behavior almost always indicating malicious intent, when you combine the fact that anyone's doing these three things is doing it because they're shipping malware, that in and of itself is enough to assume it's malware. This history in and of itself is enough to assume it's malware. The combination of the two makes it really, really unlikely that it isn't malware. The only way it is possible that Mattia didn't ship a virus inside of the icon pack, or at the very least, something that intended to harm the people who had it installed, the only way it is possible that isn't the case is if he is so fucking stupid that doing all of this was purely accidental. And that is possible. This guy doesn't seem very bright, but he does seem very unwell. And I don't think he can be trusted ever again in software without a massive ownership and apology and recognition that all of these things are really bad, harm the ecosystem as a whole, and cannot be recovered from. This isn't something you can just edit your Git commits and pretend it didn't happen, Mattia. There are too many eyes on you and your behavior now. It's over. The game has been played. You don't get to win anymore. What is particularly funny here is that despite being the one at fault, he will never apologize. He claims he's willing to collaborate after degrading and defaming people, but also requests that they apologize to him, demanding this because they are the ones who wronged him. No, we were given every single reason to believe that you are being malicious, especially afterwards his behavior. It's hard for me to fathom a world in which somebody would have made these mistakes accidentally, had their extension taken down, and then go so out of their way to continue to ship the extension, to make these hundreds of GitHub accounts and do all of the terrible things that Mattia has done without having malicious intent. But I wanted to take a little more time to try and sympathize with him. We're going to make a somewhat rough cut to a piece I filmed before about how humans perceive themselves and others in situations like this, because it's important to understand how someone gets to the point where they behave in a way that is so obviously insane. I just don't think it's human nature to be so online. And I don't think Mattia is a safe person to have be on the internet. And I hope he takes the opportunity to get offline a bit. So I'm sure this little diagram here makes no sense. We're going to do a magic little cut to when I filmed this part. So apologies to my editor phase. Let's make this one happen. This is going to be a weird dive into human psyche, and it's necessary. Hear me out, guys. Point one is that humans were not built to have the levels of info and exposure that they do with the internet. Before the internet, most people had 2 to 4 friends. Most people knew 20 to 30 people. Things like cars and cities and phones and TV and now the internet has allowed for humans to have more interactions with more people than ever before. The human brain wasn't built for this, though. The human brain was built for, I know 10 people, 8 of them like what I'm doing, 1 of them doesn't. I should use this opportunity to see why that person doesn't like what I'm doing. And if they're not understanding, I'll write them off and just pay attention to the other 8 people. Our brains were built to operate in these smaller circles. Like, if this is the people in my life, the people I know and care about, one's being negative, others are being positive, hopefully people will just do that. But sadly, it is human nature to care more about the negative things in their lives than the positive. If you have a day where you have multiple good things happen and one bad thing happen, that bad thing is going to represent a disproportionate amount of your conversations, of the time you spend in your head, the things that you do. That's an evolutionary trait humans have because it keeps us safer. If you eat a bunch of berries and most of them are fine, but one berry gets you sick, never eating berries again is somewhat irrational, but you're less likely to get killed by a poisonous berry. So why am I bringing all of this up? If we have a small circle here, we overreact to the negative, there's still enough positive in here for us to feel fine as humans. But if we take this circle and we do this with it, and we make all of those red ones way bigger, in fact, we should probably have way more of them too. Because if you're on the internet, the average person you're interacting with is not a good person. They're not a nice person. Suddenly, the amount of things in your circle has gone up a ton. The amount of things you're seeing has gone up a bunch. And the amount of negative has too. And the percentage of it that is negative has gone up as well. Most people pre-internet would only ever hear the thoughts of like 5 or 6 people in their lives about what they feel about something. With the internet, everyone has something to say about your shit. And if you can only handle, let's say, 5 things, if your circle of like what you can pay attention to and understand can only fit 5 things in it, I'll go in here and remove 2 of those. Now it's 4 positive but small, 1 negative but bigger. Just because there's more stuff here doesn't mean I can handle more. And the reality is this bigger circle has way more than 5 negative things in it. This circle has an absolute shitload of them. So if we just take those, because that's human nature, holy shit, all of the things people are saying, all of the feedback around me, everything in my life is collapsing. There is so much negativity. Everything is bad and evil, and everybody who's okay with this is bad and evil too. The only way you can cope once you're in this situation is if you convince yourself that everyone is bad, because the only people you can think about aren't the 3 or 4 nice guys that are actually in here. Those get wiped out because your brain can only process so much feedback at once. And when those get wiped out, all that's left is the negative. And when all that's left is the negative is how you're thinking, you go insane. When you're at this point, most people, even mentally well people, go mad. The size of the circle is the number of people you reasonably would interact with or would talk about you or know about you. The number of people who would know about you pre-internet, 5 to 10, now can be a lot more. There's one last aspect here, though. Let's say Mattia did actually have a somewhat big circle here. Previously, he lived life with a small one. He had like the people, maybe his like girlfriend or mom or whatever, maybe some coworkers, and he had this little circle. He was happy. All was good. He starts contributing to this material theme. All of a sudden, his circle is way bigger, and it's all positive. All of a sudden, he went from having 3 people who cared to, according to the installs on GitHub, millions. Suddenly, the high of everyone liking him and caring, it's just getting to the biology of his brain where you're not built to get that much feedback at all. And if you get addicted to this thing that humans weren't built for, the same way you would get addicted to a drug, you'll get addicted to that feeling of people saying really nice things about you. So he got addicted to that, and that went so far that he started to feel entitled. If suddenly you have this many people being nice to you, saying your thing is great, and you feel like it's a lot of work because it's the biggest thing you've ever done, you're not thinking about how hard it is to do. You're not thinking about what people need out of all of this. What you're thinking about is all of those numbers. You're seeing this big number, bigger than anything you've ever imagined, and all you've gotten out of it is a few people being nice in your replies. You haven't gotten any money out of it. You haven't gotten any jobs out of it. You haven't gotten anything really out of it. Suddenly entitlement starts to brew because your life is this small circle, but your contribution to this one thing that people used a whole bunch 10 years ago was this circle. Going from this circle to that circle feels really good. Going from that circle to that circle feels terrible. Suddenly people stopped caring about his theme. Suddenly his world started collapsing in on him effectively because the one thing that he felt made him successful, which was his contributions to this theme, no one cared anymore. But he still felt like he didn't get what he deserved from this era, from when he was here. That if he could be here, he deserves to be here. And if he deserves to be here, he deserves money for being here. And if all the other random things he did were even smaller, maybe they were tiny circles with nobody in them, which I've read through his GitHub, this is what actually happened. His other stuff just made him smaller and smaller. And that drove him insane. Rather than accept that this here was luck, the fact that you had this much positivity was a lucky roll, and now you're having bad rolls, he, like many will do, decided to blame external things. Because being at the high of this is incredible. Having to go back to normal life in these smaller circles is horrible. Rather than acknowledge that it is a personal failing or the hardest thing, that he never deserved to be here in the first place, instead, he blames the world. This is human nature. He had more exposure than the human brain was built to have, got addicted to it, it got taken from him, and rather than realize that was luck in the first place, he is now blaming the world for it. Suddenly, something bigger happened. He started harassing all these other projects because he felt entitled to their success. He felt like the reason his theme wasn't getting the attention and the money it deserved was people forking the open source version and putting it in other places. His entitlement to being in this circle caused him to do terrible, explosive, dangerous things, which is when I covered it. And that is when this happened. All of a sudden, he has more exposure than he ever had before. More people know his name than ever knew him before. All of that happened because he handled that transition so poorly. His goal was to go from here back to there. Instead, he ended up here. Now he's experiencing more negativity than he's ever experienced in his entire life because of the natural blowback to the terrible thing he did. And since he is so obsessed with having this big circle full of people being nice to him and paying him, the fact that this was the biggest thing he'd ever experienced in his life, it failed, and now suddenly he's experiencing something bigger. And the bigger thing is forcing him to acknowledge the reality of the thing he did doesn't actually matter that much, and he needs to get over himself. Instead, he brings himself here, ignoring any positivity or good faith anyone approached him with, including the good faith I started this with earlier on, my little thread up there. Anybody doing things like this, he would just ignore because he's too fixated on this. And rather than acknowledge that there's all these people who hate him, what he has done instead is invented this. Now he is convinced the real wrong is Theo. The reason there's so much negativity in his life, the reason everyone's flipped on him, the reason his life's falling apart, nobody likes him, nobody will ever hire him. Okay, that one is my fault. The fact that everything went wrong and no one believes him is my fault. And I don't blame him for that. That is human nature. If your brain is so feeble that you were meant to live in this little circle here with a couple people that have social familial obligations with you to never be mean to you, then you're not going to succeed on the internet. You're not built for this. And that is normal. Most people will not handle this circle well. And I've even seen this happen to good faith maintainers. Like, I don't want to play a specific example because I don't want to out the person, but there was a very prominent open source maintainer that felt like his work wasn't being appreciated properly because of another project that was performing really well. This open source maintainer wrote a long thing about how their solution was actually really good, and they felt like it was unfair that people were saying the other one was always better than theirs. Another influencer did a video I considered quite irresponsible, saying that they were coping in bad faith and pretending their thing was good when it wasn't. And suddenly, this person who had a little small group of people, and no, nobody in chat's guessed right. Everyone's saying that they know who it is. None of y'all know who it is. I've actually done a good job of obfuscating this one. He went from his little small circle to a slightly bigger circle of people who understood his project and cared about the thing he was doing. He was trying to defend his little circle. His circle still existed, and that was the crazy part with that guy. He still had his, admittedly not as big, but big enough circle of people who got it. And one of those little guys in it being positive was me. But another influencer, I don't want to out who they are, in my opinion, irresponsibly covered the situation and put that good faith maintainer who was probably a little too spicy with their post defending their stuff, was still working really hard, still pushing the ecosystem forward, working on a dependency that, by the way, everyone in chat has installed on their computer right now. It's a huge one. Suddenly, they're getting more attention than ever, and the majority of it is negative. There are more negative circles happening to them right now than they've experienced in their whole life up until that point. And if you've only had 5 people be mean to you in 30 years, and suddenly you have 500 people being mean to you in 30 minutes, your brain shuts down. It's not human to be able to handle that. And it's whatever disorder I have that makes me capable of it is one of the reasons I can do the influencer thing. My brain is weirdly capable of just blanking out all the negatives, just taking all these red dots and just mentally erasing them, because my brain makes the green ones bigger, not the red ones. So because of that, I can cope with the horrifying amount of negativity in my comment sections, with the terrible things people lie about me on the internet about all the time. There are so many fucking delusions that people have spread about me. They're actually kind of funny sometimes, the level they go to. Apparently, I stole my biggest project from an Indian kid and pretended it was mine. Love those ones. I have learned to value things a bit differently, though. Rather than pay attention to the negative people, I pay attention to the people who I look up to. So if I have people I care about, like the awesome open source maintainers that I regularly shout out for my success, like I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for Ryan Carniato, Tanner Lindsley, and Fred Schott. Those 3 people I respect so highly. And if any of them reach out to me and say, hey, I think that might have been an overreach, or they are concerned about something I'm involved in, this has happened, then I immediately overthink everything, address it, and do my best to fix whatever they're calling me out for, because I trust the shit out of them. And if they think I'm screwing up and I didn't, that is a thing I need to reflect on and fix. But if a non-anime pro pick account on Twitter is saying that I am a horrible person ruining the open source ecosystem, why would I value them over these awesome people who taught me how to fucking code? Why the hell would I ever value random anons over people who I actually look up to? Because my brain works that way. I can handle the negativity great. But that's like a skill I've developed over the years. Normal people don't have that skill. Their brain does the opposite. All the good things go away, and all the bad things consume their brain. You have a couple options at this point. You can cave to the mob. I won't pretend that's going to magically solve all your problems often, especially when negativity is misplaced. Like if the open source dev I was talking about earlier was to cave to the mob, it would not have benefited him at all. But the best thing to do, honestly, it's intentionally move back to the small circle. If you are forced into this big circle where everything is so super negative, delete your account for a bit. Just go offline. Go hang with people IRL that you actually know and trust, that don't get any of the stuff. Like when I'm in a big drama, I have my pocket of friends, usually from the skateboard scene, that I'll go hang with, that don't know anything. They don't even have Twitter accounts. They live in a different world. And if this is too negative, the healthy coping mechanism isn't to prove each of these red dots wrong with crazy fucking conspiracy theories. The solution is to move the fuck on, get out of there. Because when you're not responding, the circle vanishes. And all these bad people, all these negative things, they just slowly start to disappear. They feed off each other, but they grow through your attention. If you can just stop living in that circle, if you can just ignore that and go back to your small circle in the separate worlds, you'll be fine. Okay, there's a couple reasons you might not do that. One is that you don't have any friends IRL, so the circle would be empty. I have a feeling a certain individual might be in that boat. You might feel like the thing you did or that people are upset about is damaging something you care about a lot. So with this open source maintainer, the project had a lot of people contributing, and he was concerned that the negativity towards what he said would reflect poorly on the other maintainers of the project. So he was really concerned and spent a lot of time in the circle. I reached out to him because I was concerned for him. I was like, hey, you're getting negativity you don't deserve. This sucks. It's not going to feel right, but I need you to just go offline for a week or two. Just sign out, go do other things. Here's my phone number. I'm here if you need to chat. Just go chill. You didn't do anything that wrong here. The blowback is absurd. Don't take it personally. Don't blame yourself for any of it. Just go away until it's better. I don't think our friend Mattia has that, which is why Mattia went here instead. He doesn't have people who notice when he is spiraling. He doesn't have relationships and friendships and people who trust him because he just steals their code and tries to sell it. Mattia has to have a reason this is all happening. And the reason can never be that he screwed up. The reason has to be someone else, something bigger, something he can blame so he never has to deal with what he has done. And that thing is me. And I doubt he watched this far. But if he did, or if you're in a similar place, and I've seen this happen so many times, I can't emphasize enough, the best thing you can do by far is get the fuck outside. Leave the internet chaos. Our brains are not wired to be told even 3 negative things in one day. Like, the human brain cannot handle a pile of negativity at once. It's not built for that. So don't pretend it is. Don't let your brain go through the crazy mental gymnastics to figure this circle out. The human brain is not built to process this. If you try to, you will hurt yourself, and you might hurt others in the process. Chat has summarized this really well. This is the longest possible way of saying go touch grass. Yeah. Real quick thing from a VS Code team member, pretty important here. Wanted me to ask if my viewers would report abuse if they ever see anything malicious on the marketplace. There's a lot of you guys here that use a lot of these extensions. It's not that hard to download their code and take a look. If you ever see anything that's sus, don't be scared to report it as abusive, even if you're not sure. Their team is really good. These guys take this stuff super seriously. They're working hard on making the comms better and doing everything they can to make the ecosystem as safe as possible. And it's a huge difference from my experience with the Chrome team, who just kind of sit in a corner and twiddle their thumbs and pretend they're doing something to keep the world safe when they're not. These guys have been so much more responsive and involved than I ever would have expected. They've been great to work with. Don't be scared to hit that button. Give them the opportunity to keep us all safe. And I'm not the only one who feels that way. Everyone's taking this super seriously. We see the work you guys are putting in, and we appreciate it a ton. So thank you all, VS Code team, for the hard work. And to anybody else watching, don't be scared to hit that report button. Good people are keeping an eye on these things. What a wild ride this one was. I'm thankful that it's not super likely this actually ended up being malware, but at the same time, it is horrifying that all of this can go down in the open source space. There is still a lot of risk whenever you install any extension, so be careful when you do install them. And in the end, you should probably pick a different theme at this point. My fork is there if you want it, but use something else. Hopefully this helps you better understand why these things happen, and maybe, just maybe, the next time something like this happens, we will stop the person when they start harassing other maintainers instead of waiting for them to get this far down the spiral. We can catch these things early. It's the same person who harasses you at the start that does this at the end. And if we start jumping on those things earlier and calling out this bad behavior when we first see it, if we take the opportunities that we're given by these lunatics to stop them, then maybe this won't happen again in the future. So take this as a precautionary tale. When an open source maintainer deletes the entire history of their and other people's work and starts threatening to sue everyone else around them, there's a good chance we shouldn't let that person continue their work. Until next time, peace, nerds.